In this video, I'm going to show you what it might be like to buy this house in Everett, Washington with a $100,000 salary. I'll walk you through a quote for this house with two different scenarios. One where you have $40,000 cash available for the deal, and one where you have $80,000. And then I'll just briefly describe what the process looks like when you get ready to make an offer. So let's get into it. So here you can see the numbers that I'm using to create a quote. The house is listed at $576,000. The annual taxes, you can grab those off the county website. So you can see those are $4,044 annually. I'm assuming homeowners insurance of about $150 a month or $1,800 annually. And then I'm assuming credit of $740, which generally most people are familiar. There's a general positive impact with better credit and a general negative impact with lower credit. However, I am assuming a first-time home buyer here as well, which sometimes that impact of your credit is mitigated a little bit if you are a first-time home buyer to kind of try and protect first-time home buyers from it being too hard to get into your first house. And then I'm assuming $100,000 salary, which in a way sometimes kind of indirectly impacts your pricing. But mostly that's relevant just as we talk through the quotes I'm going to look at, because we're going to use the cash that you have available a little bit differently from one quote to another because of your $100,000 salary here. So I'll explain that further down the road. And then if you look at the cash available, those are the two scenarios that I'm assuming. One is you have $40,000 available. One is you have $80,000 available. Okay, so let's look first here at the $80,000 scenario, and then we'll look at the $40,000 scenario. And the reason for that is the $80,000 is a little bit simpler. So there's really just a few things to note here. I'm going to look at the total monthly payment, I'm going to look at the mortgage insurance, and I am going to look briefly at the rate here, and then I'm going to talk very briefly about why 10% down. So let's start with why 10% down, because what you notice here is I said this is an $80,000 scenario, but we're only using $71,000. So why not use the whole $80,000? Why just go 10% as opposed to more? And so the reason for that is generally, obviously, the more money you put down, the smaller your loan amount is going to be. So the smaller your monthly payment. But also, the more money you put down, the better your pricing is going to be as well, not just your loan amount. And pricing, when I say that, that includes mortgage insurance and it includes your rate. However, yes, the more you put down, the better your pricing is. However, that's specifically true. It's generally most potently true with 5 or 10% increments. So if you can get to 10% down, that's a really good threshold to get to improve your pricing. But if you're just going from 10, if you can go from 10 to 20, that's great, but we couldn't get to 20% down with just this $80,000. We couldn't even get to 15% down. So I cut it off at 10% down because that extra $9,000 wouldn't have moved us across any meaningful thresholds to improve either mortgage insurance or your interest rate. And so I just cut it off there and said, I would recommend, of course you're welcome to use more than that, but I would recommend just using that $71,000 of total cash to close here. And that includes your 10% down plus these other closing costs. So that's the general scenario there is, if you have that $80,000 on this house price, I would just generally advise go 10% down, keep that other cash, because investing that into the deal isn't going to change your monthly payment that much, so you might as well hang on to it. Again, of course, you're welcome to use it if you want. And that results here, you can see one thing to note is that results in an interest rate of 6.375 and an APR of 6.640. Now, biggest thing to note here is that when you go 10% down, the mortgage insurance is only $125 per month. And so you can look here, see your total monthly payment in this scenario of 10% down on a 576 house is going to be $3,843. And the components of that are your principal and insurance each month is going to be $3,234. You can see that there. And then your mortgage insurance is going to be $125. Your taxes at the rate that we talked about of $4,000 annually, it's going to be $333 a month. And then homeowners insurance of, we estimated $150 there. You could end up higher, you could end up lower. You can shop around. You're the one choosing homeowners insurance, but that's a kind of an average that we use to estimate. So the biggest thing to note here is your total monthly payment of $38.43, and your mortgage insurance is only $125. Mortgage insurance is something that you have to pay when you're less than 20% down in order to protect the lender in the case of default. And so you'd have to pay that in both of these scenarios, but your rate is going to be much better here if you can get to 10% down versus here, which we'll talk about next, if you're $40,000 and only 3% down. So let's shift over to that. So let's look at this $40,000 scenario. And this one is a little bit interesting because $40,000 gets you more than 3% down here, but I ended up choosing 3% down, and I'm going to explain why. And the reason why is because your salary that we assumed is only $100,000. So one thing you have to be aware of, the biggest determining factor for how you qualify for a mortgage is they figure out what your resulting monthly payment is going to be. And they take that monthly payment and they run it into a calculation called DTI, debt to income ratio. And your debt to income ratio is just what it sounds like. It's your total monthly debt over your gross monthly income. And that income is however the lender views it. If you're variable hours, they get to decide what your income is. Based on averages, they figure it out in different ways. But in this case, we're salaried, so it's pretty clear. So we have to figure out what your debt to income ratio is. And that number has to be, generally speaking, 50% or less. Now, there's some caveats there, and if you run into a situation where you were 52, I don't want to explain the whole thing right now. That's not what this is about. But the general rule is that your total monthly debts have to be 50% or less. So I'm assuming you have no other debts. And when I ran the scenario and just put $40,000 cash into the deal, and you bear in mind the closing costs, so that's about $28,000 that you're able to put down, which is a little bit more than this 3%. But if you did that, we ended up over 50% debt to income ratio because the resulting monthly payment, if you're $100,000 salary, then per month you're going to be about $8,333, and you can see here that's running pretty tight on that. If you take 4,042 and you divide that by 8,333, you can see we're already pretty tight. I think what it ended up being in this scenario is 48%. So if it was any higher than this, then it was going to be a problem. So we ran. And so that's why I had to somehow get this monthly payment down. And so I did. I took some of that cash, instead of using all of your $40,000 towards just the down payment, using $28,000 down, and then the rest for closing costs, which you see here was about $12,000. Instead of just doing that, I had to do what's called paying points. And here you can see those points here on this column right here. And over here you can see it's only 695, which our system doesn't really show. We can get a 0 points rate, but generally it just shows in certain increments. So basically this is the equivalent of 0. Whereas over here you're paying $8,856. And the reason I did that is because I had to get this monthly payment to the point where it was below 50% of 8,333. And the only way to do that is to do what's called paying points. And paying points, I'm not going to speak to the strategy of it and all that right now, but essentially it's a way to pay a fee, an upfront fee, in order to get a lower interest rate. You pay the lender and you say, here lender, I'll give you an upfront fee if you give me a lower interest rate. And so there's different good times to use it. There's different probably not as great times to use it. But the reason we had to do that here is in order to get you to qualify for this house. And so that's what it breaks down to, is $4,042 a month after about $9,000 in points. Gets you an interest rate of about 6% with an APR of 6.563. And then again, here's the main thing to note as compared to the prior quote on the left, is your mortgage insurance is going to be $210 a month versus $125 a month. And that's because you're a higher risk when you're a lower down payment. When you're only 3% down versus 10% down, you're a higher risk, so your mortgage insurance makes up for that by being a little bit higher. So hopefully that's helpful, just to give a little bit more concrete numbers and less of just a vague idea of thinking about what monthly payment am I comfortable with, and more of thinking through what would it look like on this house in this scenario. My name is Landon Buteau, and I work with a great team of loan officers at Cleveland Street Mortgage based here in Bothell, Washington. We're licensed in Washington and Idaho, and we'd love to answer questions over the phone or over email for anyone who just wants to ask questions. Or, of course, we'd love to help you get a loan and buy a house if you're ready. So please feel free to call or email our team using the information in the description in this video. My dad has been in the industry 30 years, and he leads our team and advises heavily on every loan, and he just has tons of experience. If you'd like to watch some of his videos that get into a little bit more depth of the process and strategies of getting a loan, whether it's buying a house or refinancing, check out his channel, which I'll put in the description, which is called Mortgage Mastery Theater.